How far will it escalate? Russia raining missiles on major Ukrainian urban centers in the wake of the weekend bombing of the Kerch Strait bridge. We'll ask about the latest and what you could call the response to the response, both by Kyiv and the West. No matter how much or how little damage was done, Saturday's bridge bombing, a massive public relations blow for Vladimir Putin, who made it a priority to link the Russian mainland to a Crimea he grabbed in 2014. Bruised egos versus lost lives. What next for a Kremlin whose posture has always been to escalate throughout this conflict? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at this new phase in the war in Ukraine. We're going to be joined by our correspondents that are in the field. Also with us from the frontline city of Zaporizhzhia, Tatiana Drobotzia of the Palinyatsia Charitable Foundation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting.
Retired General Michel Yakovlev is former Vice Chief of Staff at NATO's European Command. Today, Professor at the Paris School of International Affairs.
Good evening.
Nice to see you. Nice to see as well Samantha de Bendern, Associate Fellow at the think tank Chatham House.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Ukraine's national anthem, led by a professional opera singer. It's back to the opening days of the war, with residents of the capital, Kyiv, forced to shelter in the metro. It's been a harrowing day for many, with this Monday, a death toll of at least 11 killed, more air raid sirens sounding afterwards. Kathy Clifford has more.
Scenes of devastation across Kyiv as the injured receive treatment. Russian missile strikes hit the Ukrainian capital for the first time in months at rush hour on Monday, as well as dozens of other cities throughout the country.
We hope for our victory, but it's awful for the civilians who are dying. And not just for the civilians, but also for the military, for the sake of one idiot who leads Russia.
President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure, as well as civilians, using some Iran-made drones.
They want panic and chaos. They want to destroy our energy system. They are hopeless. The second target is people. Such a time, such goals were specifically chosen to cause as much damage as possible.
Several cities were left without power or water supplies. The Prime Minister said 11 infrastructure facilities in 8 regions and in the capital were damaged by the strikes, spread right across the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the strikes came in response to what he described as terrorist action, including an attack on a bridge linking the annexed Crimean Peninsula to Russia this weekend.
By its actions, the Kyiv regime has aligned itself to international terrorist formations with extremist groups. To leave such crimes with no response is just not possible anymore.
Zelensky said he made urgent calls to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss strengthening air defense and increasing pressure on Moscow.
Let's begin in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent is there. Catherine, what's the latest you can tell us?
Good evening, Francois. Well, here in Kharkiv, there's an atmosphere of, I'd say, weary defiance amongst a lot of people. They say that they just know all too well the feeling of being bombed. This city, of course, was shelled pretty much relentlessly for the first 3 months of this war, and Russian troops approached very close to the city entrance and almost surrounded it at one point. So they've lived through very heavy attacks, indeed, and very sustained attacks. And some people here had been starting to come back to the city and rebuild their lives somewhat. So this is a blow for them. The missile strike in Kharkiv mainly targeted a power station on the outskirts of the city, which deprived Kharkiv of electricity for most of the day, although that came on just as the evening was drawing in here. So people, there are still some cars on the streets. A lot of people spent today inside or underground. A reminder perhaps of some of the darkest days of the war, but a feeling of defiance, a feeling that they resisted onslaught at the beginning of the war and that they will continue to do so. One man said to me, if this is what Vladimir Putin's got, and he took days to gather these missiles to strike across Ukraine, if that's what his response is, well, we can handle worse than that.
Handle worse than that. What's the plan for those you spoke with regarding tonight? Is it back to those early days of the war and people were sleeping in the Kharkiv metro?
It's difficult to say for a lot of the people, François, because we arrived quite late into the day. We drove up through the Donbass, where we'd been reporting earlier, where, of course, fighting on that front line continues. Pretty heavy clashes around the city of Bakhmut, notably, and the constant drone of strikes, that noise in the background, very much ever present there in cities such as Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, although it has got further away, of course, as Ukrainian forces have pushed Russian troops out of territory that they had been occupying. But I think that this sense of defiance, it doesn't feel like the first days of the war here when the city centre was being pounded. So people here have been feeling more optimistic in recent months and feeling that this is an action by Russia because they can't take territory as they were planning to do so. So instead they're hitting back with these missile strikes.
Catherine Norris-Trent reporting live from Ukraine's second city. Many thanks. Tatiana Drobosya, let me ask you, first off, the long-range strikes in a lot of cases, you, however, are close to the front line. What's the feeling where you are?
You know, I have the same feeling as Catherine said before. So people in Zaporizhzhia, I think people in Ukraine during these 8 months are already used to the missile strikes. So we are not so scared as it was before in February. But it's really, today it felt like 24th February again, because we have never heard that much, that much cities has never been hurt. And what is in Zaporizhzhia? So starting from the Independence Day of Ukraine, starting from the 24th of August, Russians became attack my city every night, every day. And during the last week, it's getting worse and worse, because before they usually hit at night. And during the last week, they hit at daytime, in the evening. So it depends. At night, they hit the residential area, so just the regular blocks of flats, because they want people. No, but I feel that they want to kill as much people as possible. At daytime, they attack critical infrastructure. And for example, last week, it was one missile at the regional gas company. So a lot of people were at their working places, and also the fire defenders also were hit by missile. So Russia really does terroristic acts every day with my city, and a lot of people, unfortunately, especially those who have children, they just left the city. But in Ukraine now, most of the people are just moving inside the country, because a lot of programs that were at the beginning of the war from the Europe countries and from the other countries as well, they are already stopped. So people choose, for example, Dnipro or Lviv or Kyiv, because even yesterday, those cities for most of the Ukrainians sounded as safe. But today, Russia again showed their face, and that 83 missiles that we faced in the morning. This is actually how the life goes in Ukraine. That's how we feel. But in Zaporizhzhia, it's getting harder and harder every day, I would be honest.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about Zaporizhzhia in a moment and what happens next. Among the targets in the capital, there was a public playground And there was what's called the Klitschko Bridge, a glass-paneled landmark. We could show you closed-circuit television footage shared by an advisor to Ukraine's interior minister there. We can cross to Kyiv, and France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg now. Gulliver, we had on Sunday, after the hitting of the Kerch Bridge, those people taking selfies, funny memes against the Russians having their bridge attacked. Now there is this. What's the feeling today after what we've seen?
Well, perhaps it's best summed up by the response of one man I spoke to in Shevchenko Park in central Kyiv today, by the crater where the missile hit. I asked him what he thought Ukraine's response should be, and he said, "Hit the Crimea Bridge again." I think that's the spirit of defiance that a lot of people here have. Although many Ukrainians, though not all Ukrainians, and interestingly not the defense ministry apparently, believe that these attacks are retaliation for Ukraine's attack on that bridge linking occupied Crimea with the Russian mainland, that doesn't mean that they think Ukraine shouldn't have done it. People say, yes, but it was to be expected that Russia would retaliate. I mean, I don't think everybody expected it to happen in just this way, but Ukrainians can't possibly regret it, I think, because, they don't see this bridge as a civilian infrastructure, as Vladimir Putin claims that it is. For Ukrainians, and I think that international lawyers and Ukraine's allies would agree, this is obviously a military target, because this bridge was being used to bring Russian military materiel from the Russian mainland into Crimea, and then northwards from Crimea into southern Ukraine, Kherson region in particular, where fierce battles are going on as Ukraine tries to claim back the territory that Russia occupied in that region. And so it's part of Ukraine's war effort to target this bridge. It's clearly an important thing for them to be able to try to prevent Russia from bringing this materiel this way. So although people, see this as a retaliation, or at least some of them do, they don't think Ukraine has very much choice. I mean, that's the refrain I've heard again and again from people today. When I ask what should Ukraine do, more or less everybody says Ukraine doesn't have any choice. Ukraine can only just defend itself against these Russian attacks. And if Russia choose to interpret parts of Ukraine's efforts to defend itself as some kind of provocation or describe them as terrorist acts, well, Ukraine can only hope that the country's allies will not see it that way and will not fall for this kind of narrative being pushed by Russia.
Let's talk about that bridge for a second. 48 hours after the presumed bomb blast that rocked the Kerch Strait Bridge, road and rail service has been partially restored, but some 650 heavy trucks filmed waiting for ferries in Crimea to cross over to Russia. According to Russian investigators, the truck transited through Bulgaria, Armenia, and Georgia. The one that's involved in the blast, purportedly involved in the blast, was officially transporting plastic film. The driver took the cargo on Russian soil and was among, this is according to Russian media, the 3 killed. Michel Yakovlev, what happened on that bridge?
Well, I suppose the explosion. I have nothing to add to the pictures. I have something to say about the story of the bridge seen by the Ukrainians. In, I think, 26th of November 2018, 3 vessels of the Ukrainian Navy wanted to go under the bridge into the Sea of Azov, which for them was international waters, and they were intercepted, captured. I think 3 or 6 crewmen were killed, and for the whole year it was a saga of negotiation trying to get the 24 hostages or prisoners of war back, and ultimately the boats. That lasted for a whole year, and President Putin really played it in the most vicious way, playing on the nerves of the Ukrainians. So for the Ukrainians, beyond what has been said about the strategic value of the bridge, it's also, you get that one back, my friend.
Is it a legitimate target, Samantha de Burton?
I would say it is, yes. I mean, it's first of all, it's linking Russia to a part of Ukraine that Ukraine does not recognize as being occupied by Russia, neither does anyone else in the world. So it's a direct instrument of occupation. It is, as has been said already, a way to bring military supplies into Crimea. It's also a highly symbolic target because Putin himself opened this bridge. It's his great pride and joy that this was the only visible demonstration of bringing Russia and Crimea closer together, because in Crimea life hasn't really improved that much for the people living there. So this is really a legitimate, a political and a symbolic target all wrapped up into one. So if the Ukrainians are behind it, they've killed three birds in one stone.
Kill three birds in one stone. Is it more of a public relations coup, or have they done significant damage militarily?
Well, traffic has resumed on the bridge, but it's still, from what I've heard, quite difficult to get military supplies in and out of Crimea. They've damaged the morale of people in Crimea. I mean, the day after the blast, people were scrambling to supermarkets to get food. They were worried about being able to leave the island, or the presqu'île if they had to. So no, it's a very significant coup for the Ukrainians. Much more than just public relations. And the Ukrainians haven't actually said it was them.
Sorry to turn back to the question I asked you earlier. What do you surmise? It's a purported truck bomb. Was it a truck bomb? Who planted it?
I'm not a forensic expert. We saw pictures, and the Russians have said it's a truck bomb. It looks like the most likely way of doing it. What's brilliant was the synchronization with the train.
That can't be a coincidence.
Either it's a miracle or it's a coincidence that the train was there and apparently stopped, which is bizarre. So it does show that some people had real information, very precise information. Another thing to be said is that if it's the Ukrainians, it's a one-off. It's their first try, and it's successful. That also exposes the Putin regime incompetence as compared with the Ukrainian competence, if it's their action.
Two things. First of all, if it is the Ukrainians, it was done at a time to ensure minimum civilian casualties. So 3 people are supposed to have died, but it was done at a time of day where there was going to be minimum circulation on the bridge. And as for the Russian claims that they've practically solved this murder or this attack already, it's just important to remember that some high-profile murders that took place in Russia, the murder of journalist Anna Politkovskaya 16 years ago, Boris Nemtsov in 2015, have not really been solved yet. They've been sort of a semblance of finding scapegoats, but it's taken years to solve these murders. And all of a sudden, in 48 hours or less than 48 hours, they know really who's behind the explosion on the bridge. I'm not a forensic expert either, but I do know that forensics take months, if not years, to get to the bottom of what happened.
Tatiana Drobotsia, people around you in Zaporizhzhia on Saturday, were they jubilant, or were they going, uh-oh, the other shoe's going to drop, we're in for retaliation?
No, actually, we were happy, because for us, it's not a civilian infrastructure, as it was said before. For us, this is a bridge that brings weapons, that supplies army, that kills us. So that's why, even for me personally, I was really happy, because just maybe for a day or maybe for a couple of hours. So I don't know, the details, how much time that bridge was closed. But I know that those Russian soldiers would not receive any help. And I know that even for the soldiers, it was really, it was really bad news, So I know that a lot of them just left their guns and decided to leave the battlefield. And honestly, I don't think I'm not a political expert, but I don't think that it could be Ukrainians, just because if we just go to the history, like 20 years ago, when Russians put the bomb inside the civilian residential houses, block of flats, and then said that it was agents of Chechnya, and then they started the war. So even now, for me, just for the regular person in Ukraine, it looks like this. So this is the breach, and then we need just an option. We need just a reason to hit the whole Ukrainian cities at the same time, and then to ask Lukashenko to join the army, because it looks like a strategy, but maybe maybe it's not true. Maybe it was Ukrainians. But for me, as a person who lives here and who doesn't want to leave because it's my city, it's my country, it was good news. We had a good morning.
Gulliver Cragg?
Hello?
Yeah.
It's peculiar, I think, that the Ukrainian leadership haven't, denied this attack in any way, even though there are these quite credible arguments being made that it may well not have been the Ukrainians. And that's what the Defense Ministry of Ukraine was saying today when apparently saying that they had evidence that Russia was preparing these attacks already since before the explosions happened on the Crimea Bridge, and then this might all have been a premeditated thing and that the Russians did that. But if that's the case, I mean, wouldn't we have seen Volodymyr Zelensky or Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister, saying something more along those lines of expressly denying it, rather than just kind of making jokes about it and allowing the Ukrainian people, including the post office with its commemorative stamp, to go right ahead and celebrate it?
Yeah, it has been, I know some have compared it to an air of mystique like Israel's Mossad after they commit an attack, neither confirming nor denying and leaving everyone else guessing. I have to ask you, Michel Yakovlev, because we're with Tatiana, who's in Zaporizhzhia. Mm-hmm. We've seen the retaliation this Monday, and the retaliation has involved, obviously, long-range missiles.
Yeah.
In her case, though, that's not the case, because she's within range of those Iranian-made drones, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm. Of course, I don't know what kind of ordnance went where. And beyond the moral case or the legal, or in this case it's immoral and illegal and everything, criminal, beyond that, there's one thing to be said. On the military side, it's completely stupid. It's completely stupid. It's a total waste of ammunition. It is achieving nothing on the battlefield. And by the way, their soldiers have been complaining bitterly about the lack of fire support when they were under pressure from the Ukrainians. So here you have the regime which is directing much needed fire support from its soldiers into completely worthless targets, now just creating havoc and misery in the depth of Ukraine, achieving nothing because the previous bombardments have achieved zero, absolutely zero. So he doesn't have...
Achieving nothing if it's a one-off, but if we have the same every night...
I mean, Kharkiv was bombarded for 3 months and it didn't change. They're not going to surrender, the Ukrainians, and I suspect the ability for the regime to throw a large amount of ammunition like last night will not last forever. Maybe he has 5, 6, 8, 10 nights and then he'll be off. And by the way, the same Russians on Russian TV are saying that NATO is preparing to attack. Well, if I were Russian, I'd say, let's keep my ammunition for the day NATO comes. So it's a contradiction in terms to accuse NATO of preparing an attack on Russia and wasting very expensive and sophisticated ammunition on targets that have zero impact militarily.
All right, Russians and also Belarusians. The Belarus president, Alexander Lukashenko, speaking of a NATO plot against him and announcing a joint deployment with at least 1,000 Russian forces on his soil, kind of a throwback, if you will, to the early days of the war where the Russians attacked Ukraine from Belarus soil.
Due to the escalation on the western borders of the Union state, we have agreed to deploy a regional grouping of the Russian Federation and the Republic of Belarus.
Now, Samantha de Burnham, we did hear the Ukrainian foreign minister speaking to France 24 earlier, describing this as a worrying development, and you heard Tatiana's concern about Belarus.
Yes, I mean, I've been in touch with a lot of Ukrainians today, some of whom have links to the Ukrainian intelligence service, and I'm speaking with their authorization that they are getting more and more signals from Belarus that something might be preparing. But something might be preparing is not the same as an attack actually happening. And one thing that's really important to understand with Alexander Lukashenko, he needs the support of the Belarusian army to stay in power. he needs the support of all the power structures to stay in power. He was elected in 2020 with what are widely recognized to be fraudulent elections, and he used his security services to suppress the population. There are a lot of signs that people in the Belarus army are not in favor of this war. You have a lot of Belarusians fighting in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side. So Lukashenko is walking a very fine line here, because if he loses the support of his army, he will fall out of power. And that is something that he has to bear in mind. Is this saber rattling? Is he going to try and get enough loyal troops together to attack Ukraine? It's really difficult to say right now. It is worrying. It's worrying that he's going to be using Belarus again as a staging platform to send troops into Russia. But are we going to see Belarusians in Belarusian army uniform in Ukraine? I don't think we're quite there yet. And if we do get there, this could spell the end of Lukashenko's regime as well.
Gulliver Cragg, is this fog of war stuff to try to divert Ukrainian troops away from the front?
I mean, I don't know. The Ukrainians have to keep their northern border defended, and I believe that they haven't moved their defences fully away from the northern border. What we generally hear in Ukraine is a sort of confidence that the Belarusians won't actually do it, because Lukashenko is well aware of the low morale among his troops or unwillingness to fight for his regime, and wouldn't really want to test them. And the Ukrainians feel quite confident that they would make short shrift, really, of any Belarusian invading force. And I've even heard some Ukrainian military personnel almost kind of hoping for it, because if we could prove once and for all that they can't do it, then we'd get rid of this threat. And then after they had made some attempt to attack from the north, then we could actually, move some personnel away from that direction. But, the Russians keep on maintaining the pressure on northern Ukraine from across the Russian border in Sumy region, which you don't talk about very much. But Sumy region in northeast Ukraine is constantly subjected to short-range artillery bombardments, and it's widely believed that the purpose of that is just that, to keep a certain amount of Ukrainian forces occupied defending that border, even though there are no attempts at a sort of land incursion in that direction.
Michel Yakovlev?
Yes, and also the Belarusians I'm sure, are not eager to meet the most competent and strongest army in Europe today. That is roundly defeating what was supposed to be the second army in the world. So today is not the day to pick a fight with the Ukrainians, basically.
All right. Nonetheless, we've seen these missiles landing everywhere, which may or may not be a one-off, and we've had foreign reactions, including Estonia's prime minister. She was speaking on the border with Russia in the company of the visiting president of the European Commission, and calling for the EU to provide air cover for Ukraine.
We are standing here at the eastern border of European Union. Their background is Russia. We send a clear message to all the Ukrainians. We are supporting you every possible way, and what we have to do is definitely deliver air defense from the Allies' side, so that the Ukrainians can protect their cities, their civilians, because Russia is definitely escalating to harm the civilians.
Kaja Kallas seems to have been heard over in Berlin, where the defense minister announced that these missile shield systems that were planned I think, for the end of the year have been moved up and will be arriving in the coming days.
Yes, indeed. So I think this is, again, what the European Union has been put in front of its need to really think about its common defence and how far it will go to defend Ukraine. And there's the old argument here that the Ukrainians are actually fighting for European freedom right now in Ukraine. And however terrible it is, Ukrainians are losing their lives for us, not for Ukraine. And Europe's decision to help Ukraine is not about helping Ukraine, it's about defending Europe. And the more people understand that, the more we will be able to help, the EU will be able to help Ukraine, and the safer the whole of Europe will be.
This is a defense matter. Why not stand, in that case, next to the NATO Secretary General instead of the President of the European Commission when she says that?
Because this is about Europe. This is not about NATO. NATO is not Europe. And this is one of the big questions that a lot of people, particularly in the Baltics, have about NATO. Depending on who is president of the United States, let's say in 2024, if Putin is still in power, which is a big if, and he decides...
It's a big if.
I think it's a very big if. And he decides to tip his toes, let's say, into Estonia. Will Article 5 be automatically triggered? Article 5 of NATO, which is the collective defence article, an attack on one is an attack on all, does not elicit an automatic response. So Europe's security has to be in European hands, and that is what the European Commission is thinking about very clearly right now. One little question, a little comment about Estonia. These images are taking place, I believe, in Narva.
That's
Narva,
right. Correct.
So Narva is a city that Putin has often mentioned as having once been part of the Russian Empire, and is a city that he clearly feels should belong to Russia. So the Estonians have a very clear reason to be afraid of potential Russian incursion in Estonia. And that is why they are so insistent on a European defense in this case.
We spoke earlier, General Yakovlev, with one Ukrainian member of parliament who said these air defense systems should have been delivered a long time ago. Could Europe have gone faster?
I suppose I suppose it could have, technically. Since March, I was advocating for supporting directly with air defense. We have every right to provide air defense to Ukraine on Ukrainian soil. We have every right to do so. I believe we have a moral obligation to do so, for the argument that you have said, Samantha.
You say you have the right to, but isn't that direct confrontation with Russia then?
Well, the idea is fly aircraft and potentially missiles over Ukraine at your own risk. We're not shooting them in Russia, or Belarus, by the way, which is an accomplice to the war, but legally speaking. We have every right to, we have every right to shoot Russian aircraft or missiles over Ukrainian soil. Sorry. Now, politically, of course, this is a completely unpalatable and it's not working. I happen to agree with the Ukrainians that it should have been done. And today could be, if I dare say, the pretext, if we needed one. We could say, given this escalation, massive escalation, okay, the European Union response is deploying some missiles.
That's clearly what the German defense minister has said.
So but is he going to do it? Is it happening, or are they talking about it?
I've been so involved in following this today that I haven't got the precise details on what the Germans have actually said. So I really don't want to say something that's not correct.
She said, Christine Lambrecht saying that the first would now be, quote, ready for the effective protection of people in the coming days.
Okay, well, that seems to be pretty clear. And there's a reason why the Germans are also getting very worried. Today, Lviv was bombed. Lviv is a city in western Ukraine, which is, I think, closer to Berlin than it is to Kyiv. So in terms of potential for escalation, if one of those missiles, and they're not very precise, were to drop a few kilometers further west, it would be dropping in NATO territory on Polish soil. So we are getting very, very close to some very dangerous moments here where NATO territory could potentially be hit by a Russian missile. And then what is NATO going to do? And again, the whole point is that right now, NATO and the EU want to avoid an obligatory escalation and want to try and keep this contained into Ukraine. However dreadful this is for the Ukrainians, because, and I'm repeating myself, this is for the protection of Europe and the alliance.
Tatiana Drobosya, we've gone from one, and you heard there Samantha use the word, escalation to another. And each time there's an escalation, it can be seen as, in this case, good news if Ukraine is getting its wish, the military hardware that it's been asking for since the beginning of the war. On the other hand, you are, a few dozen kilometers from Europe's largest nuclear power plant, which is in Russian hands. Your thoughts on the fact that we just seem to be going from one escalation to the other?
Oh, yes. Before you were talking about Belarusian, yes, so they just joined Putin. And for me in Zaporizhzhia, it's not the worst news because I'm close to the nuclear power station that is also doesn't have electricity and is working on generators and has only 10 days, and I think it has 7 already. So this is the first point. And the second one is mobilization. So 300,000 people just arriving here to our territory, mostly to the south. So it's also close to my city. But for me, as a civilian person, this air attacks looks like the biggest disaster, because I would tell you just the process, how it looks like. In Ukraine, we don't have enough air defense systems, and that's why when I hear the air alarm, it means that somewhere the missile has been hit already. And what happens in my city during the last week? So I hear the first missile, and sometimes it's really close to me, sometimes it's further, but it means that I don't have any time to go to the shelter or somewhere, because usually the missile attack lasts for like 5-7 minutes, but there are a lot of them. So the one, especially if it's happening at night, so everything what I can do, just pick up my pillow and pick up my some clothes and just go to the entrance area in my apartment or to the bathroom, somewhere where I don't have windows, and just sit and wait, and and think that maybe this missile wouldn't be next to my house or in my house. What happened 2 days ago? The Caliber missile just hit the residential building just really, really close to me. And those people who were there, they were just maybe unfortunate, but they didn't even have a possibility to be in a safe place. So, if I'm pretty sure that we can kick those Russian assets out of Ukraine, our militaries can do that for us, but our militaries cannot do nothing, with this air attack. So if someone is who know how to do these decisions, hear me. So our biggest wish is to have more air defense systems in order to cover our cities, and other things our soldiers would do.
Gulliver Craig, you were in Zaporizhzhia last week reporting when that apartment block was hit by the Russians from across the river. Your thoughts on what can be done in the short term?
I mean, I don't really know what do we mean about the short term. If Ukraine needs to get more air defense systems, they seem to be working pretty well. If they had more, they would work better. I don't think that anyone in Ukraine is seriously advocating for a pause in the military operations to try to retake territory that they are doing. If anything, these kinds of attacks just galvanize Ukrainians all the more. Today, apparently, just one of several high-profile fundraisers that there are to raise money to help the Ukrainian army, to help the war effort in general, raised 6 million euros from Ukrainian individual people who were donating money just today, and just one fund. So that's the reaction that people have, is we need to help the army more. That seems to be the reaction that people have. I think there's perhaps one point that I wanted to make, that is one reason why Ukrainians really feel that this is an existential war for them. If you look at what was targeted today in the center of Kyiv, was it completely random? Were they trying to hit the children's playground? I think they were trying to hit the statue of Taras Shevchenko, which stands in Shevchenko Park. And the other missile that hit 200 meters away, that hit on the street corner there, is right near the statue of Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, who was the first head of state of the very short-lived Ukrainian independent state in 1917. These are symbols of Ukrainian statehood, and I think that it was an attempt to hit those symbols. Well, they missed.
They missed those symbols. Samantha de Bendren, the support for arming Ukraine is going up. A poll was done in Germany after those blasts under the sea in the Baltic Sea on the Nord Stream pipelines. Support going from 70%, I believe, of Germans to 74%. Your thoughts, though, on how public opinion here in France, in the UK, in Germany is going to fare after the latest developments?
Well, so far as the UK is concerned, public opinion has always been very much behind Ukraine. And I think that is very historical for the British. There's a sort of DNA, the Blitz is sort of etched into British DNA, the bombing of London. When Hitler intensified the bombing of British cities, British support for the war increased. And although this was a war that was taking place on European soil, not on British soil, apart from the bombs. So the British have been supporting Ukraine. I've noticed in France a lot of wavering. There was definitely a lot of wavering from the government's point of view in the beginning, when Macron was talking a lot about we need to have a dialogue with Putin, you mustn't humiliate Putin. Macron's dialogue has switched really quite radically since his trip to Kyiv, and also since some of the atrocities that were uncovered later on in the summer, earlier on this year. So Macron has changed his tune, and he's much more bullish towards...
He calls Russia's retaliation a profound change.
Yes, well, he's had a number of profound... Macron had a number of profound changes, so I don't know whether this is even more profound than the ones that came before. But... the French population, I feel, is still very split on the issue. There's still, to a lot of people, the Russian services have been very, very effective at penetrating French society to begin with, particularly academia. And two, there's a sort of anti-Americanism in France, which sees that anything that is anti-American has to be good. And since the Russians are anti-American right now, they obviously have to be good. So I see public opinion in France being divided. I don't know. I mean, I'm not French, so the
Michel Yakovlev, right now, if you look 2 blocks away, there's long lines at the gas station because there's a refinery strike, and one of the hardline trade unions wants a 10% wage hike. Is this just a domestic matter, or is this part of some grand geopolitical battle?
No, I understand that. The way I've seen it in the press is not that it's linked. Yes, there is a general context about energy scarcity and so on, but that's a very French strike. Let's keep it that way. It's very French to have a strike at the wrong moment, and that's what's happening. So it's not for me a sign, or it's not exploited to let's say to go lukewarm over Ukraine. I don't know. I understand the polls in France are going up in support of the Ukrainians. Now, my personal experience is that I don't know many people who have very positive views of the Putin regime, and I haven't met any for quite some years. So my point of view may be a bit skewed as regards French public opinion in general.
Many people who support Putin, many, and I've met them over the years, and I still meet them today.
Still meet them today, although today was quite a day. If you look,
not today, maybe October 10th.
When you look at what people like Tatiana have had to experience, Tatiana Zaporizhzhia, your thoughts on how the world views Ukraine today, vis-a-vis the way it viewed it on February the 24th or 23rd, if you will, before the war started.
I really appreciate all the help that people from European Union and people from all over the world help us to fight not only for freedom, not only for resistance, but I think to fight for humanity, because I couldn't even believe that in 2022 I could be again, like in the history. In the history book, because sometimes for me one day feels like 1941 or 1943, and I couldn't even imagine that we can face such a terrible terroristic war in Europe. And I know that that Ukrainians would do everything for their homes, would do everything for their cities, and that's actually my position, because I can relocate, but I don't want to do that, because I think that everyone here needs to support to win this war, and that's why I'm pretty sure that if we can do something with Putin, with his army, and with Lukashenko's army as well, starting from today, I'm sure that we would live in much more better world, in a world where every person matters, And I think that we can do it shortly, all together.
Tatiana Drobotsia, we wish you and yours all the best under the circumstances. Thank you so much for joining us from Zaporizhzhia. I want to thank our correspondent Gulliver Cragg reporting from the capital, Kyiv, Michel Yakovlev, Samantha de Bundern. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.